Welcome to the Wild West, a time of cowboy legends, fierce frontier battles, and stories that make us nostalgic for that rough-and-tumble American spirit. But let's get one thing straight. If you think the Wild West was glamorous, think again. Today, we're diving into one of the grimmiest, stinkiest, most cringe-worthy parts of frontier life: hygiene. Imagine this: dusty trails, sweaty cowboys, rivers they would bathe in once every few weeks if they were lucky, and the same outfit day after day. Yep, the hygiene in the Old West was about as wild as the gunfights. In this episode, we're uncovering the gritty reality of frontier life to see just how rough things got. Prepare yourself for some serious ick. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you're updated on our latest content. Thanks for tuning in. Let's start with the universal fact of life back then. Everything, and I mean everything, stank. Unlike today, where hot showers and soap are daily norms, the settlers in the Wild West had to face life without easy access to either. And the smell? Well, let's just say it was unforgettable. Water was a precious commodity on the frontier, and wasting it on frequent bathing was almost laughable. Most settlements had limited water, which meant that clean water was often reserved for drinking and cooking, not bathing. And that created an environment where dirt, sweat, and grime became a regular part of life. Water sources were so scarce that sometimes a single body of water would serve multiple purposes: drinking, washing, and waste disposal. According to Distinctly Montana, it wasn't uncommon for an upstream outhouse or cattle watering hole to pollute the same water people drank. This made clean, potable water something of a luxury, and it meant the entire settlement often carried an earthy scent. Imagine gathering around a campfire surrounded by the smells of unwashed bodies, livestock, and outdoor latrines. That's the true aroma of the frontier. So, what did bathing look like in the Old West? Picture a small, rusty tub, maybe filled with water if you were lucky, and located outside or in a communal bathhouse if your town even had. In many cases, if a family had a tub, it was filled once a week, and each family member took turns in the same bathwater. The cleanest person bathed first, while the dirtiest person got whatever murky leftovers remained. Bathhouses did start to pop up in larger towns, especially during the gold rush era, when wealthier prospectors and miners wanted a little luxury. But for the average settler and cowboys, bathing was a rare event. Some might go weeks or even months without a proper wash. That means a layer of dirt and sweat was standard for everyone. And while they didn't have our modern standards of cleanliness, they were certainly aware of the smell. Frontier folks did have some tricks to freshen up. Some of them used herbs like sage or lavender to mask their scent. Tobacco smoke was also a popular way to cut through the stink. People believed it purified the air around them, but it added another layer to the aroma. Now, let's talk about the facilities, or lack thereof. Plumbing in the Wild West was practically non-existent, meaning bathroom facilities were primitive. The most common form of bathroom was the humble outhouse. These were typically small wooden structures built a good distance from homes and towns to keep the smell at bay. Inside, you'd usually find a simple wooden bench with a hole leading directly to a pit below. This pit would fill up over time, and when it got too full, it was either dug out by hand, someone had that unfortunate job, or the entire outhouse was moved to a new pit. It's different from the sanitary experience we're used to today. In urban areas, public outhouses might be shared by dozens or even hundreds of people, which makes them breeding grounds for bacteria and diseases. And let's remember the fly. These little pests were everywhere, drawn to the waste and contributing to the spread of germs. If you've ever been camping and used a pit toilet, imagine that experience without modern maintenance, and you'll get a taste of the Wild West bathroom routine. Toilet paper was not widely available until the late 1800s. Before it became available, people used whatever they could find. Corn cobs, leaves, grass, and even pages from the Sears catalog. Not exactly Charmin Ultra Soft, right? If you're squirming already, just wait until we discuss dental hygiene. With a lack of modern dental care, the Old West was a nightmare for teeth. Sugar, which became more widely available, was enjoyed by settlers in treats like pies and candies. But sugar did a number on their teeth without regular brushing or flossing. Tooth decay, cavities, and gum disease were rampant, and the solution was often as brutal as the problem itself. Since few professional dentists, dental work usually fell to barbers or blacksmiths. These folks weren't trained, and anesthesia was often a swig of whiskey if you were lucky. Toothaches often led to extractions, and by extractions, I mean someone yanked the tooth out with pliers or whatever tools on hand. The results were as painful as you'd imagine, and people often ended up with missing or broken teeth, which only added to the rough, rugged look of the era. Some people used improvised brushing tools like twigs or animal hair to clean their teeth. They might rub salt or baking soda on their teeth as a primitive form of toothpaste. Still, it was rare and less effective than our modern options. Many people simply went without brushing altogether, which led to, you guessed it, more bad breath and even worse dental problems. One of the biggest hygiene-related issues on the frontier was the spread of disease. Lack of sanitation in both personal hygiene and communal spaces meant that diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were constantly present. When people relied on contaminated water sources, diseases spread quickly. Entire towns could be wiped out by outbreaks. Take cholera, for example. This deadly disease spreads through contaminated water, causing severe dehydration and often death within hours. Because sanitation was so poor, people living on the frontier were particularly vulnerable to cholera outbreaks, especially in mining camps, where large groups lived in close quarters and relied on the same limited water supplies. Even a small infection could turn deadly without antibiotics or modern medical treatments. Something as simple as a cut could lead to sepsis, and the limited knowledge of germ theory meant that people didn't fully understand why they were getting sick. Bad air or bad luck was often blamed instead of poor hygiene. Another common illness was typhoid fever spread by contaminated food or water bacteria. Symptoms included fever, stomach pain, and a rash. People on the frontier couldn't access clean cooking facilities, so food preparation often led to contamination. It wasn't just the unsafe water. Any food cooked with it carried the same risks. Preparing meals in the Wild West wasn't just inconvenient. It was often dangerously unhygienic. Cooking was typically done over open fires or in makeshift kitchens where dirt, dust, and animal droppings were ever present. Settlers often prepared meals in cramped cabins or open camps where sanitation was impossible to control. Dust storms could coat everything in a layer of grit, and flies and other pests were a constant problem around food. Fresh water was a luxury, so dishes and cooking utensils were often cleaned with reused or minimal water, if they were cleaned at all. In dry regions, settlers had to use muddy or tainted water from creeks shared with livestock and wildlife. Due to fuel shortages, this water was rarely boiled, meaning any bacteria or parasites in the water went straight into their cooking pots. Food storage posed another major hygiene issue. Without refrigeration, meat spoils quickly, especially in the summer heat. Settlers often dried or salted meats to preserve them. But even then, food was prone to infestation. Insects lay eggs in grains or flour, so finding weevils or maggots in meals was a common and unsettling occurrence. The phrase protein surprise was no joke. Pioneers often had to eat around the bugs or pick them out before cooking. Basic food prep was also risky. Knives, pots, and pans were rarely sanitized, as no cleaning agents were available. Leftover scraps and bones often attracted rodents and insects. Without waste disposal systems, settlers lived with the constant smell of rotting food nearby. This setup made food poisoning and illness from contaminated meals a frequent hazard, leaving many settlers battling stomach illnesses they didn't fully understand. In the harsh conditions of the Wild West, cooking wasn't just labor-intensive. It was a daily battle against contamination and disease. Food might have kept settlers alive, but the unhygienic conditions made each meal a potential health risk, reflecting the rough and unsanitary survival on the frontier. Let's talk about clothing. Washing clothes on the frontier was almost as rare as bathing, and for the same reason. Water was scarce, and washing took time and effort. Most people owned just a few sets of clothes, which they wore repeatedly until they practically fell apart. When they did wash them, it was usually in rivers or stream sources that, as we've seen, were often polluted. Laundry day was a back-breaking process. Women typically handled the washing, scrubbing clothes on washboards, boiling water over open fires, and using homemade soap if they had any. Soap was costly. It involved rendering animal fat and mixing it with lye. This highly acidic substance could cause burns if not handled carefully. And the result? People often wore their clothes dirty, stained, and sweaty, and since there was no deodorant, the smell was intense. Imagine a cowboy in heavy, sweat-soaked wool or leather after days out on the trail, with no showers, clean clothes, just layers of sweat and dust. Now that's a smell to remember. Now what about hair care? Today, conditioners, shampoos, hair masks, and salons are on every corner. But back in the Wild West, hair care was as rugged as it got. Men and women alike often had long hair, but washing it regularly was not an option. Most settlers washed their hair maybe once every few weeks. Instead of shampoo, people used what was on hand: soap if they could spare it, or natural remedies like oils and animal fats to keep hair from becoming unbearably dry. Hair would get tangled, greasy, and filled with dirt and dust. Lice were also a major issue. With so many people living in close quarters, lice spread quickly, and infestations could last for months without proper treatment. Sometimes the only way to deal with lice was to shave your head or use crude remedies like kerosene, which was both dangerous and unpleasant. For skin care, forget lotions and moisturizers. The skin was exposed to the harsh sun, dry air, and extreme temperatures, leading to chapping, sunburn, and premature aging. People used animal fat or oils as moisturizers. Still, these options weren't widely available and often came with their own smells and greasy texture. Those who worked outdoors, like cowboys and farmhands, would get sunburned, windburned, and calloused. The sun was brutal on the skin, and with no sunscreen you can imagine how leathery and weathered people's skin became over time. If you've ever been annoyed by a mosquito buzzing around, try dealing with the pest situation in the Old West. With all the dirt, waste, and lack of sanitation, the frontier crawled with bugs and rodents. Flies were a constant nuisance, especially around outhouses and food supplies. Mosquitoes thrived around stagnant water sources, spreading diseases like malaria in some areas. Bedbugs were common in the inns and boarding houses, where travelers and townsfolk state. They infested mattresses, bedding, and walls, biting people in their sleep. Fleas were also a huge issue, especially since livestock was everywhere. These pests got into clothing and bedding, leaving people itching and scratching. With no pesticides or bug sprays, there was little people could do to control the infestations. In rural areas, rats and mice were a persistent problem, especially in food storage areas. They spread disease and contaminated whatever food they could get into, creating yet another health hazard for frontier folks. And let's not forget scorpions and snakes, which were a regular threat to anyone sleeping outside or in poorly built shelters. Pest control was often left to whatever natural remedies or sheer endurance the settlers could muster. Frontier life was particularly challenging for women, especially regarding personal hygiene. Menstruation products, as we know them today, didn't exist, so women had to get creative. They often used rags or scraps of cloth as makeshift pads, which they'd have to wash and reuse. This was time-consuming, and given the limited access to water and soap, there were better sanitary options. Pregnancy and childbirth were also risky business. Hospitals were scarce, so women often gave birth at home with only the help of a midwife or neighbor. Sanitation during childbirth was minimal, and infections were common. Without modern antiseptics or antibiotics, even a small infection could be deadly. Women's clothing didn't help matters either. Heavy dresses, petticoats, and corsets were the norm, which made washing and drying clothes even more challenging. These clothes were hot, restrictive, and nearly impossible to keep clean on the frontier. Imagine wearing layers of thick fabric in the summer heat, unable to wash them regularly. It's no wonder women, too, resorted to using herbs and smoke to mask odors. The limited understanding of germs and infection didn't help hygiene on the frontier. The science of medicine was still in its infancy, and many settlers believed in folk remedies or had only basic medical knowledge. Doctors were scarce, and even when available, they lacked the tools and understanding to prevent infection. For wounds and injuries, settlers often used alcohol or herbs as antiseptics, but this was only somewhat effective. Bloodletting was a common practice, and some illnesses were treated by releasing bad blood, with the belief that it would draw out the sickness. This often weakened the patient and did little to address the real problem. Surgery, when necessary, was done without anesthesia other than alcohol or a biting stick, and sterilization was unheard of. Instruments were used repeatedly without cleaning, spreading infections. With conditions like gangrene, a lack of hygiene could quickly turn a minor injury into a life-threatening condition. If they existed, frontier hospitals were often crude, with dirt floors and little sanitation. Mortality rates for surgeries were high, and infectious diseases ran rampant. Interestingly, while European settlers struggled with hygiene, many Native American tribes had much more effective methods for cleanliness. Many tribes had long traditions of using natural materials for bathing and hygiene, like sand and plant fibers, to scrub the skin. Sweat lodges were a common part of their culture, providing a way to cleanse the body and mind. These practices kept them relatively clean and were deeply connected to their beliefs about health and spirituality. Unlike the settlers, Native Americans also had more sustainable methods for waste disposal and water management, which often helped them avoid some of the sanitation issues that plagued frontier towns. They bathed more frequently and used herbal remedies to treat minor injuries and prevent infection. This contrast highlights how much the European settlers had yet to learn about adapting to the natural environment in ways that didn't lead to filth and disease. So let's clear up a few myths about frontier hygiene. Movies and TV often show the Wild West as dusty but romanticized, with cowboys and saloon gals looking for cleaner and fresher than they would have been. They would have looked much rougher, grimy faces, unwashed hair, and dirt-caked clothes. Cowboys weren't quite the chiseled, clean heroes we see on screen. After days or weeks out on the trail, a cowboy's clothes would be stiff with sweat and grime, and his hair and beard would be wild and unkempt. Saloon girls, often portrayed as glamorous, faced the same hygiene struggles as everyone else, with limited access to clean water, bathing, and fresh clothing. The same goes for gunslingers and gamblers. These men didn't stroll into a saloon looking fresh and polished. They'd likely be sweaty, dusty, and smelling of tobacco, alcohol, and horses. The Wild West was gritty and dirty. Those iconic characters were too. So, just how bad was hygiene in the Wild West? Pretty terrible by today's standards. Hygiene was a constant challenge, and life on the frontier was dirty, smelly, and often dangerous due to the lack of proper sanitation and medical knowledge. Disease was rampant. Basic comforts like bathing and clean clothes were rare luxuries, and every day was a battle against the grime and filth of the frontier. Yet the people of the Wild West endured. Despite the discomfort and the filth, they managed to build towns, families, and communities in a rough and unforgiving land. Their grit and resilience are a testament to human endurance, even if the reality of their daily lives wasn't as glamorous as the Hollywood version. So, next time you turn on the faucet, grab a bar of soap, or brush your teeth, just be glad you weren't doing it on the frontier. When it comes down to it, the Wild West was many things: brave, bold, and adventurous. But clean? Not a chance. And there you have it, the gritty truth about hygiene in the Wild West. Not exactly the romantic image we often picture, right? Thanks for watching. If you want more tales from history that dig up the dirt, don't forget to like and subscribe.